You know Florida for its beaches, its theme parks, its retirement communities, and its year-round sunshine. 42 million tourists arrive every year and see exactly what Florida wants them to see. But there's another Florida, one that hides behind the palm trees and the neon signs. A Florida of crumbling concrete and rusted metal, and places that the state would prefer you never visited. An island that Disney abandoned and now refuses to talk about. A highway built directly over the graves of children. A rocket launch pad where 3 astronauts burned to death, that NASA just left standing in the salt air. In this video, we're going inside 11 abandoned places in Florida that locals are too scared to visit. Some of them are haunted, not in the ghost story sense, but in the way that places with real, violent history become haunted by what happened inside them. Subscribe. Let's go in. Number 11. Cape Romano Dome Houses, Collier County. The alien houses, sinking into the Gulf. About a mile off the coast of Marco Island, rising from the shallow water of the Gulf of Mexico, are 6 dome-shaped concrete structures that look like they were designed by someone who had never seen a house before. They were built in 1980 by a retired oil producer named Bob Lee. He designed them as a self-sustaining vacation home, solar panels, rainwater collection, hurricane-resistant concrete. Each dome was a different room. Connected together, they formed a 2,400 square foot structure sitting on a pristine barrier island beach. For years, the Lee family used it as a retreat from the mainland. Then Florida's coastline started moving. Storm after storm. Hurricane Andrew in 1992. Hurricane Wilma in 2005. Each one pushed the domes closer to the water. Erosion ate the beach from underneath them. By the late 2000s, the structures that had once stood on dry ground were sitting in the tidal zone, surrounded by water at high tide, marooned in shallow flats at low. Today, the domes are fully offshore. The Gulf is slowly claiming them. Walls have collapsed. The interiors are open to the water and weather. Marine life has colonized the concrete. Divers find sea creatures living in what was once a kitchen, a bedroom, a living room. You can reach the Cape Romano domes by kayak or boat. You cannot go inside, the structures are considered dangerously unstable. But sitting offshore in calm water and watching them slowly dissolve into the Gulf, you understand something about Florida that the tourism board never tells you. The state is not as permanent as it looks. Number 10. Annie Lytle Elementary, the Devil's School, Jacksonville. The school that a highway buried alive. In downtown Jacksonville, jammed up against the intersection of I-95 and I-10, where 2 massive interstate highways cross each other in a tangle of concrete ramps and noise, there is an old brick school building with neoclassical columns and a name carved in stone above the entrance. Public School Number 4. Locals call it something else. They've called it the Devil's School for over 60 years. Built in 1918 as Riverside Grammar School, the building served generations of Jacksonville children for over 4 decades. It was named Annie Lytle Elementary in 1950, honoring a beloved principal who had led the school for 35 years. For a brief moment, it seemed like the building would outlast everything around it. Then the interstate highway system arrived in Jacksonville in the 1950s. City planners drove I-95 and I-10 directly through the neighborhood 100 feet from the school's front door. The noise from traffic drowned out second-floor classrooms. The expressway severed the building from the neighborhood it served. In 1960, Annie Lytle closed for the last time. The building was used for storage, then condemned, then abandoned entirely in 1971. What happened next is what created the legend. Drug users and vagrants moved in. Graffiti covered every surface. A fire in 1995 caused the auditorium roof to cave in. And teenagers, because teenagers always find these places, started sneaking in at night to test their courage. The stories they told afterward became legend. A janitor who burned students in the boiler room, a cannibalistic principal, satanic rituals in the basement. None of it is true. The Jacksonville police have confirmed that every crime at Annie Lytle happened after the school closed. The real story, a neighborhood killed by a highway, a building trapped under an overpass with nowhere to go, is less dramatic and somehow sadder. Today, the building is fenced, monitored by cameras, and patrolled in partnership with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. You cannot go inside. But you can drive past it on the interstate, and if you look at exactly the right moment, you'll see those neoclassical columns between the highway ramps, a school that the city built a highway around and then simply forgot. Number 9. Miami Marine Stadium, Virginia Key. The stadium that a hurricane turned into an art museum. On the shores of Virginia Key, just across the water from downtown Miami, there's a stadium that hasn't hosted an event since 1992 and has become, in the decades since, one of the most visually extraordinary abandoned spaces in the entire country. Miami Marine Stadium was built in 1963, designed by a 28-year-old Cuban immigrant architect named Hilario Candela, who had never designed a stadium before. The result was unlike anything built before or since. A cantilevered concrete roof stretching 326 feet, supporting 6,566 seats that faced the open water of Biscayne Bay. No walls, no enclosure, just a roof, seats, and the bay stretching out in front of you. For 29 years, this was one of Miami's greatest venues. Powerboat races drew national television coverage. Sammy Davis Jr. performed here. President Nixon attended events here. Pope John Paul II celebrated Mass here in 1987 for a crowd of hundreds of thousands. The stadium was an icon. Then Hurricane Andrew hit South Florida in August 1992. Engineers found cracks in the foundation. The city condemned the structure and closed it permanently. What followed was one of the longest and most baffling abandonments of a major public venue in American history. For over 30 years, the stadium has sat empty. The seats are broken. The concrete is stained with decades of salt air. And every surface, every wall, every column, every accessible inch of the structure has been covered in murals and graffiti by Miami's street art community, transforming the ruin into something that looks like a cathedral of color. Restoration efforts have been proposed and discussed for years. None have succeeded. The stadium sits on the National Register of Historic Places, officially recognized as worth saving. It just hasn't been saved yet. And every day it sits empty. The Bay Air eats a little more of Hilario Candela's masterpiece. Number 8. Discovery Island, Bay Lake. Disney's secret that the jungle swallowed. In the middle of Bay Lake, surrounded entirely by Walt Disney World property, there is a 12-acre island that Disney has been trying to pretend doesn't exist for over 25 years. Discovery Island was a zoological theme park that Disney opened in 1974, originally called Treasure Island. Guests arrived by boat to walk nature trails and see exotic birds, Galapagos tortoises, and lush botanical gardens, a quieter, more contemplative experience, just minutes from the Magic Kingdom. For 25 years, it was a well-loved part of the Disney experience. Then Disney opened Animal Kingdom in 1998. Discovery Island became redundant overnight. The animals were relocated to other facilities. The staff were reassigned. And in 1999, Disney quietly closed the island and walked away. They didn't clean it out. They didn't secure every structure. They just left. Signs still point to exhibits that no longer exist. Buildings still contain equipment from operations that stopped in 1999. The animals that once entertained guests have been replaced by wildlife that moved in after the humans left vultures, raccoons, snakes nesting in what used to be ticketing booths. The jungle has been consuming the structures for over 2 decades. Vegetation has overtaken walkways and buildings. What was once a carefully manicured Disney attraction now looks like something from a post-apocalyptic film. Disney actively prosecutes trespassers. Several urban explorers have been arrested for accessing the island without permission. But the footage they captured before their arrests shows something genuinely extraordinary, a piece of Disney's past that the company cannot control, cannot sanitize, and cannot stop from slowly returning to nature. Number 7. Sunland Mental Hospital, Tallahassee. The hospital that became a horror story. We're halfway through, and it only gets heavier from here. Hit that like button and subscribe. Stay with us. In Tallahassee, where the state government keeps its offices and the political class keeps its illusions, there was once a hospital so horrifying that its name became synonymous with institutional abuse across all of Florida. Sunland Mental Hospital opened in 1952 as part of a chain of state facilities for people with developmental disabilities. It was supposed to provide care and support. What it provided instead, across multiple locations around the state, was a masterclass in neglect, overcrowding, and cruelty that would not come fully to light until the 1970s. The Tallahassee facility housed thousands of patients in conditions that investigators eventually described as inhumane. Overcrowding was severe. Staff-to-patient ratios were catastrophically low. Physical abuse was reported but rarely prosecuted. Patients lived in buildings that hadn't been properly maintained in years. The smell, according to those who worked there, was never fully gone from your clothes. In the 1970s, investigations into the Sunland system forced major reforms. The Tallahassee facility was closed and shuttered in 1983. The building sat empty for over 2 decades, decaying into the Florida humidity. Urban explorers who documented the site in the early 2000s found crumbling walls, rusting medical equipment, and hallways that felt like they retained something of what had happened inside them. Sunland Tallahassee was demolished in 2006, but the footage and photographs documenting its final years survive, and they are among the most unsettling visual records of institutional abandonment in Florida's history. Number 6. The I-4 Dead Zone, Seminole County. The highway built over children's graves. Between Orlando and Daytona, on a stretch of Interstate 4 that drivers cover thousands of times without thinking about it, there is a section of highway that locals refuse to treat like ordinary road. They call it the I-4 Dead Zone. The story begins in the 1880s. A man named Henry Sanford sold land near Lake Monroe to a group of German immigrants who had come to Florida to build a new life. They established a settlement called St. Joseph's Colony. Only 4 families arrived. In 1887, one family was completely wiped out by yellow fever. The other settlers, terrified of contagion, buried the dead in a field nearby, marking the graves with wooden crosses, and fled. The graves sat in that field for decades. When the land was sold and resold, the grave markers rotted away. No one recorded exactly where the bodies were buried. The field became farmland. The farmland became suburbia. And in the 1960s, when the government planned Interstate 4, surveyors mapped the graves for relocation. The graves were never relocated. Instead, they were covered with filled dirt, paved over, and built into the highway foundation. 4 unmarked graves lie directly beneath the southbound lanes of I-4, somewhere near the St. Johns River Bridge. What happened next is debated. This stretch of I-4 consistently records a disproportionate number of accidents and fatalities compared to surrounding sections, something that Florida Department of Transportation data has documented. Electronic equipment has a documented tendency to malfunction at this location. Radio signals break up, cell service drops. Whether the dead zone is genuinely haunted or simply a coincidence wrapped in legend, The stretch of highway that passes over those 4 forgotten graves has been generating strange incidents and unanswered questions for decades. Number 5. Aerojet Rocket Factory, Homestead. The secret space program in the Everglades. Deep in the Everglades, 5 miles from the edge of Everglades National Park, hidden in a landscape that looks from the air like an abstract geometric painting, sits the largest abandoned rocket manufacturing facility in the United States. Most Floridians have never heard of it. In 1963, as the space race consumed the national imagination and unlimited defense money flowed into aerospace companies, the U.S. Air Force paid Aerojet General Corporation $3 million to build a rocket manufacturing and testing facility in the remote swampland south of Miami. The company paid just $2.50 per acre annually for the land essentially free. Workers built enormous test tunnels, manufacturing bays, a star-shaped network of canals for transporting rocket components, and miles of access roads through the swamp. The facility was intended to manufacture massive rockets for the Air Force's military space program. The tunnels alone were large enough to stand inside, with room to spare. The canal system, still visible on satellite imagery, covers hundreds of acres in a pattern that looks like something designed by a science fiction production designer. The program was canceled before a single rocket was ever launched from the site. The facility was abandoned in the mid-1970s. The Everglades began its patient reclamation. Today, the buildings are rusting and partially collapsed. The tunnels are filling with water and vegetation. Alligators have claimed the canals. Parts of the site are accessible to adventurous visitors willing to navigate Everglades terrain. What they find is something extraordinary, an enormous piece of Cold War infrastructure, swallowed by one of America's most fragile ecosystems, a secret that the swamp kept for 50 years. Number 4. Fort Dade, Egmont Key, the island fort. That time forgot, at the mouth of Tampa Bay, accessible only by boat, sits a small island that holds the ruins of a military installation that the U.S. government built, used, and abandoned over the course of a century, leaving behind brick buildings slowly being consumed by sand, jungle, and time. Fort Dade was established on Egmont Key in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. At its peak, over 300 soldiers were stationed here, monitoring the entrance to Tampa Bay and operating gun batteries that were never fired in combat. After the war, the fort was maintained as a coastal defense installation through 2 world wars, adapted each time to new technologies and new threats. By the 1920s, the island had a small civilian population. A lighthouse keeper lived here. Soldiers came and went. Egmont Key was a functioning, if remote, outpost of American military and maritime life. Then the technology changed. The kind of fixed coastal defense that Fort Dade represented was obsolete. The garrison was reduced. The civilian population drifted away. By the 1970s, the island was completely abandoned. Today, Egmont Key is a national wildlife refuge and state park. A ferry runs from Fort DeSoto, and visitors can walk the island. What they find is extraordinary brick ruins being slowly swallowed by subtropical forest, streets that still show their original paving, pushing through overgrown vegetation, a lighthouse still operational but otherwise surrounded by abandonment. Sea turtles nest on the beaches where soldiers once drilled. Gopher tortoises wander through crumbling buildings. It is one of the most beautiful and most quietly devastating abandoned places in Florida. Number 3. Cassadaga, Volusia County, Florida's town of the dead that's still alive. Here's a Florida ghost town that never fully died and has been talking to the dead for over 100 years. Cassadaga was founded in 1894 by a spiritualist medium from New York named George Colby, who claimed a spirit guide had led him to this specific patch of Florida scrubland and instructed him to build a community there. Colby was a trance medium, someone who believed he could communicate with the dead while in an altered state. He gathered followers who shared his beliefs, and Cassadaga was established as a permanent spiritualist community. Over a century later, it is still exactly that. The town has about 100 buildings and roughly 200 permanent residents, most of whom are certified mediums, psychics, and healers. The Cassadaga Hotel, built in 1927, is still operating and is reportedly one of the most actively haunted buildings in Florida, with guests reporting apparitions, unexplained sounds, and sensations they can't explain. The town has its own bookstore, its own auditorium for lectures, and signs outside every practicing medium's home advertising their services. What makes Cassadaga genuinely unsettling is not the ghost stories. It's the atmosphere. The streets are quiet in a way that feels different from ordinary quiet. The buildings are old and slightly out of time. And the residents, people who have dedicated their lives to the belief that death is not the end, move through this small Florida town with a certainty that belongs to another century entirely. Whether you believe any of it is beside the point. Cassadaga exists. It has been here for 130 years, and something about standing in its streets on a gray Florida afternoon makes even the most skeptical person walk a little faster back to their car. Number 2. Dudley Farm, Alachua County, the farmhouse, where time stopped in 1942. Outside Newberry, on a stretch of North Florida farmland that looks the same as it did 100 years ago, a farmhouse sits in a state of preservation so perfect it feels like trespassing on someone's life. The Dudley farm was a working farm, operated by the same family, the Dudleys, from the 1860s through 1942, when the last family member to live there, Myrtle Dudley, finally left. She took almost nothing with her. Today, the farm is a Florida state park, and what the state preserved when it acquired the property is extraordinary. The farmhouse still contains original furniture from the 1930s and 1940s. The kitchen has original implements hanging on the walls, the smokehouse, the sugarcane mill, the barns, the syrup kettle. All of it is still standing, still in place, frozen at the moment. Myrtle Dudley walked out the door for the last time in 1942. The farm grew most of its own food, processed its own sugarcane, smoked its own meat, and operated almost entirely independently of the outside world. Generations of the Dudley family were born in this house, married in this house, and died in this house. Walking through it today feels less like visiting a historic site and more like entering someone's home, unannounced, a home where the owners stepped out 80 years ago and never returned. Number 1. Launch Complex 34, Cape Canaveral, the launch pad, where 3 astronauts burned to death and NASA just left it. There at Cape Canaveral, surrounded by the active launch infrastructure of one of the busiest spaceports on Earth, there is a concrete structure that hasn't been used in over 50 years. NASA calls its status "Abandon in Place." It is Launch Complex 34, and it is the most quietly devastating abandoned place in Florida. The complex was built between 1959 and 1961 to launch Saturn rockets as part of NASA's Apollo program, the program whose goal was to land a human being on the moon by the end of the 1960s. Between 1961 and 1968, it launched successfully 5 times. On January 27, 1967, it killed 3 men. The crew of Apollo 1 command pilot Gus Grissom, senior pilot Ed White, and pilot Roger Chaffee had climbed into their capsule atop Launch Complex 34 for a rehearsal test. No fuel, no propellants, considered non-hazardous by NASA standards. Routine. At 6:31 p.m., a fire ignited inside the capsule. The spacecraft's atmosphere was pure oxygen, highly flammable. The flames spread in seconds. The hatch design required 90 seconds to open from the inside under ideal conditions. Inside a burning capsule, those conditions did not exist. In 17 seconds, all 3 astronauts were dead. The investigation revealed systemic failures, flammable materials throughout the capsule, inadequate escape mechanisms, warning signs that had been noted and not acted upon. Apollo 1 was a disaster that was predictable and preventable, and the knowledge of that never fully went away. NASA used Launch Complex 34 one more time for Apollo 7 in October 1968, and then shut it down permanently. The mobile service towers were demolished. The umbilical tower was raised. The launch platform was left standing, along with the 2 massive steel flame deflectors on their rails and the concrete blockhouse. Abandon in place. Today you can visit Launch Complex 34. A plaque is embedded in the concrete. 3 granite benches face the launch platform. The inscription reads, "In memory of those who made the ultimate sacrifice so others could reach the stars. Ad astra per aspera. A rough road leads to the stars." The platform stands in the Florida heat, oxidizing slowly in the salt air. Around it, modern rockets rise and fall from newer complexes. The machinery of space exploration continues to operate a few miles away, and the concrete platform where Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee died during a test that was supposed to be safe stands silent, unmaintained, and unremarked except by the people who stop and read the plaque and understand what abandon in place really means. It means we don't know what to do with it. We can't fix what happened here. So we leave it, and we hope that the standing there, that the concrete and the rust and the silence is enough of a memorial for the men who died inside it. 11 places. A vacation home slowly dissolving into the Gulf. A school that a highway buried and forgot. A stadium that a hurricane turned into an art gallery. A Disney island that the jungle reclaimed. A hospital that the state closed because it was too ashamed to explain what happened inside. A highway built over children's graves. A rocket factory hidden in the Everglades. An island fort being swallowed by tropical forest. A town of people who talk to the dead. A farmhouse where time stopped in 1942. And a concrete launch pad where 3 astronauts burned to death that NASA left standing in the Florida sun for over 50 years. Florida tells you it's the Sunshine State. It tells you about the beaches and the theme parks and the eternal summer. What it doesn't tell you is that underneath all of that, this state has been leaving things behind for a very long time, and some of what it left behind refuses to stay buried. If this video made you see Florida differently, share it with someone who needs to see it. Drop a comment and tell us which of these places you'd most want to visit or never visit. We'll see you in the next one.